They want to be independent, and they're explorers. They want to get out there. They want to experience things. They want to find out about life, and they learn best through interaction. If you have your middle school kids sitting in rows and they're never allowed to speak and interact with each other, you're fighting against who they are. Once you know who they are, you can personalize that environment. They like to be social. They like to discover things. How do you build that into your lessons? I was in a middle school in Oregon doing an evaluation last week, and I saw one of the most exciting science lessons I've seen in a long time. And this 7th grade science teacher was talking about AIDS and how it is spread through bodily fluids with 7th graders. And she was using the correct terminology because these kids were with her. She gave every single kid in the classroom a test tube. All the students except for one had water in their test tube. One student had a base liquid that could be told by, it was clear, but when you put an indicator in it, it would turn bright pink. She asked the students to exchange bodily fluids with 4 different kids in the classroom. So they'd go up and they'd pour it into their friend's test tube, and their friends would pour it back, and they would record it 4 times, class of about 30 kids. They sat down. She went and took an indicator, put a drop in every test tube. Out of those 30 kids, only 2 kids in the class were HIV-free. Their test tube, their liquid stayed in water. Everybody else had been exposed to the one child in the classroom that was carrying the virus. You know, those kids were interacting, they were talking, and think of the impact that made. She could have sat up there and talked about a lesson and how it spreads and everything, but she got them involved, and they were there. These kids, at the same time, while they want to be independent, I can do it my way, they're very sensitive and vulnerable and emotional. As an assistant principal and a principal, I remember having big husky 8th grade football player boys down in my office, and I'd ask them a question, well, why did you say that? Why did you do that? And they would burst into tears, and they would start sharing with me something that had happened at home that night before, and how the police had come pounding on the door at midnight because their mother's boyfriend had come, broken into the house, and was beating up their mom. And they're very emotionally, even though they may appear tough on the outside, they're being influenced by others. They reach physical maturity a lot faster than their grandparents, and they look physically mature, but inside they are still emotionally and socially and cognitively growing. And we have to be there to support them, and we have to be there to help them. And this last one, the general public has a limited understanding. How many of you have ever gone up to somebody, or they have come up to you and they say, well, what do you do for a living? You say, oh, I work at a middle school, and their response is, oh, I'm sorry. That happened to anybody? Oh, you poor person. How do you stand it? We've got to be, I work at a middle school and I love it. I love these kids. They're humorous, they're caring, they're compassionate. But you watch on TV, how are they portrayed? You read in novels, how are they portrayed? Yes, they have that emotional uproar, and yes, they can be very contrary and difficult. But they also have a side that is just wonderful. This is knowledge that every single teacher, every single administrator, every single cafeteria worker in the Atlanta Public Schools that works with middle-aged students need to understand. Who are these kids? It's a piece of knowledge that you have to build leadership on. You know these kids, you understand them, so that you can pick the right strategies, the right programs, the right organizational structures to help them out. Another big piece, collaborative leadership. It's involving everybody in the process. Think about it for just a minute. In your school, if you're a teacher, how do you have voice? How are you able to express your opinions in your school and let your thoughts and concerns and ideas be heard? If you're an administrator, how do you allow the teachers, the staff in your school to give you voice, to give input? to bring about change in your school? How in your school do you allow students to have voice? Do the kids have choices? Do the kids have opportunities to tell you, this is working well, this isn't working well? A friend of mine, principal of a small school in the state of Idaho, he has a 5th through 8th grade school, and his goal is to take every student in his school out to lunch once while they're in the school. And he made a deal with the local Pizza Hut that they provide a lunch, and once a week he takes a 5th grader, 6th grader, 7th grader, and an 8th grader out for pizza lunch. He says it cost him 30 pounds, but it was well worth it because he understands what's going on in the school, just listening to those kids talk. How do students in your school have a voice? How do parents? I know that's one of your initiatives, looking at how can you bring in more parent voice, more parent involvement. In my school, I had 65% free and reduced lunch in my school, about 20% non-English speaking, English as a second language, Spanish speaking students. We had about 40% of our parents come to student conferences when it was time for teacher-parent conferences. We switched over to a process called student-led conferencing. We jumped to 95% of our parents came to school for conference because the student was the one responsible for presenting the conference. And we helped instill in the students a need to get their parents there, and they came, and that has held up for probably 17 years or so since it was started, that high level of participation. You know, collaboration requires a vision. Have you determined in your school where you're going, what you're trying to do? I know the goal of Atlanta Public Schools for the middle school transformation is to have all schools ready to apply for schools to watch status. I think is it within 5 years is your goal? Something along those lines. That's a great vision, but what does it mean? And what is it going to look like when you get there? I love Yogi Berra. If you don't know where you're going, you'll end up somewhere else. Is that vision articulated? Is it shared? Is it grown? Is it nurtured? Because that's what it takes in order for it to happen. It has to be nurtured among the staff, among the parents, among the students, among everybody in that school's learning community. If we had more time, if you hung out at my school when I was principal, I read children's books to my staff all the time. They had a good message to them. And it got so teachers would bring me books and say, oh, here's one for you to read. And this was one that one of my teachers brought me. And it's the story of Dumpy LaRue, the kid who knew what he wanted to do. Because Dumpy LaRue wanted to be a dancer. And everybody in the barnyard says, pigs don't dance. They do all sorts of things, but they don't dance. But Dumpy LaRue was a pig who knew what he wanted to do. He wanted to dance. And it goes through and it tells the story about how Dumpy danced, and his vision caught on with everybody in the barnyard until everyone was dancing at the end because he knew what he wanted to do and what it took to get there. I love the phrase in the book. They describe him as a porker with passion. You know, so I ask you, are you a porker with passion? You know, do you know where you're going? Are you willing to bring everyone along? Do you have the excitement? You know, Fullen talks about if we want to improve schools, we have to do it with collaborative cultures. And I know that culture and school culture and change is another part of your initiatives. And that is something that takes work. It's got to be in place, and that feeling of collaboration has to be there if you want to move on. Building that culture of collaboration and shared decision making isn't always easy. There's a story told about a man who wanted to visit heaven and hell, and his wish was granted. And he was taken down to hell first.